Okay. We're going to talk about neurons. But in general, organisms have to respond to their environment. Not all organisms obviously have neurons. In fact, the only ones that do are animals. Almost all animals have some sort of neurons, except for sponges. Now, a lot of organisms still have to respond to their environment. They can respond chemically. They can respond because of sources of light. So plants don't have an immune system, a nervous system, right? But they have something called phototaxis, where they can follow light source, like the sun. So the sun might come out, and it induces a plant to have its flower open up in the daytime, and at night close down, things like that. Okay. Most animals, except for sponges, in other words, everything like jellyfish, to insects, to mollusks, to vertebrates, all have an immune system of some sort. They don't necessarily have a central nervous system like we do. Like a jellyfish has what's called a nerve net, where there's a series of neurons that are attached to essentially muscle-like tissue so that it can move, but there's no like brain or anything like that. So a lot of our nervous system has to do with reflex. In other words, not consciously moving, automatically moving. So, little baby comes along, or an infant who's big enough to walk, and puts his hand on a hot stove. He's not thinking, he's crying, but he's not thinking, pull my hand away. No, it comes off, right? That's a reflex. So there's a number of things that are associated with the reflex. There is a sensory neuron. We'll say in this case, touch. There's also a sensory neurons that have to do with the visual cortex, right? Seeing in your eyes, hearing, smelling, tasting. These are all sources of information coming in from the outside world. There's always a sensory neuron attached to these incoming sources. There's also something called an interneuron. So once a sensory neuron receives a signal, it has to pass it on, and it usually passes it on directly to an interneuron. And the interneuron can then pass it on to, part of it will go to the brain, but some of the sensory neurons will go to the motor neuron, which are attached to like muscles, let's say. And so with a hot stove, you touch, that's a sensory neuron. The signal goes through an interneuron, then goes to a motor neuron, which immediately causes you to pull your hand away. So those are the three types of neurons that we're going to deal with for the most part of today. Now, an effector is anything that is something that is in response to a signal from a neuron, whether it's touch, whether you pull your hand away, whether it's a visual signal coming in, and what do you do? Well, if a monster came in here, we wouldn't be sitting here thinking about what we should do. We would do one of two things. We'd freeze in place, or we'd run like hell, right? That's an automatic reflex response. Now, there's other things that we do that we think about, but this is all unconscious. And it's important because oftentimes you don't have to have time to think. Okay? Thinking takes too much time. So, knee tap. When you go to the doctor, they tap your knee goes. Reaction to unexpected painful stimuli, or let's say nice stimuli. Salivation in response to a smell of good food. Well, that's just kind of like the second one. Reaction to a nice stimuli, which is the smell of good food. Gag response when exposed to nauseous stimuli. None of these things involve or rely on cognitive thinking or thought. So, this is the direction of the behavior. Effectors can be other things besides muscles. They can have to do with release of hormones, like visual stimuli that is scary will likely cause your adrenal glands to release adrenaline, which is part of the flight or fight response. For our purposes, we're going to say that we have a central nervous system, and in vertebrates, it's the brain and the skull that protects it, and the spinal cord that is protected by the vertebrae. Okay? So, CNS. That's the central nervous system. Now, once the nerves start branching out from our spinal cord at various places on it, it goes to different parts of our body. So, thoracic vertebrae, the nerves that go from there, they branch out from those vertebrae into our arms. Cervical vertebrae into our neck and face. Lumbar vertebrae down into our digestive system, and then into our legs. So, the nerves in the peripheral nervous system are all the nerves that actually after they branch out from the central nervous system. So, this is the vertebral column. Let's see. These are the nerves coming out and going to various parts of the body, right? Okay. Actually, let's... Okay. Now, in the brain, we've got a skull. We've also got these meninges that protect our brain, and this cerebrospinal fluid, and then there's something called the blood-brain barrier. So the brain has to be protected. And one way to do that is to stop anything from getting into it except what needs to get in. So the brain can only use glucose. It can't use any other source of food, whether it's converting fat into glucose or whatever. It's always glucose. It's there to stop the invasion of the brain from, let's say, pathogens or poisons or anything like that. It's pretty effective. In fact, a lot of the drugs that we would like to, let's say, treat the brain with, can't get there because of the blood-brain barrier. And so oftentimes you actually have to get an injection through your spinal cord fluid. Okay. So capillaries are the smallest blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood. We've got them all over our cells. The brain's capillaries are pretty impermeable because of certain characteristics that they have. Okay. The cerebellum, the outer layer of the so this is the whole upper part of the brain, including the neocortex. Of course, we have the skull, cerebrospinal fluid. Here's the cerebellum that coordinates a lot of coordination, physical and muscular coordination. Hypothalamus controls center for sex drive, pleasure, pain, hunger. The thalamus is a relay center for sensory information, and it releases a whole bunch of hormones. And then finally, the brainstem, which connects to the spinal column. It governs heartbeat, breathing, swallowing. So anytime you have a damage to the brainstem, it's usually fatal. They can kind of keep people alive with, like a machine for breathing and things like that, but it's generally not a good thing. Okay? It's a little too early to talk about coma and brain death, so forget it. Anyway, you understand. Brain injuries can be pretty bad. Though, some people have serious brain injuries, let's say when they're young, and they come back with almost no deficits at all. Because that's when our brain is still developing all the way until we're into the early 20s. So young people who have brain injuries are much likely to do better than older people. Okay. The dendrite accepts incoming signals. So this is a neuron. The signal then travels down the axon to the terminal. Then the terminal is near the next dendrite of the next neuron. Unlike a lot of other cells, neurons are not easily replaced. So, essentially, a signal in a neuron is like an electrical signal. It is. But instead of using actual electrons, they use ions. That means these are electrically charged elements, whether they're positively charged or negatively charged. So, in this case, we have a whole bunch of sodium ions that then actually pass on signal. Here, inside here, there's also potassium ions as well. And as you can see, oh, come on. The sodium ions are passed on from one gate to the next, all the way down the axon. So it propagates the signal in the form of ions that are positively or negatively charged. Surrounding neurons are this kind of sheath. So think about a wire that's surrounded by like the plastic or rubber covering around, let's say, a filament of copper. That's so the electricity or the electrons don't leak out. The myelin sheath kind of provides the same source of protection so that the signal, the neuronal signal, doesn't leak and makes the neuronal response less efficient. Let's see. Multiple sclerosis, which I talked to you about earlier just recently, about an autoimmune disease, actually attacks the myelin sheath. And so people who end up with multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease, they start having nervous system problems. There's all kinds of things they can do to stop the decay, but it's not a pretty disease. But there's some new drugs coming on the market that seem to actually at least halt and maybe improve problems that you've lost because of multiple sclerosis. So here we are with that. Go on. There's some recent advances. I mentioned antigen-specific therapy is kind of an older one now. There's some more recent stuff. I'm not going to go into that right now, though. Need it. Oh, there's also stem cell therapy, perhaps, but nothing's worked so far. Now, here's a neuron, the dendrite, that receives a signal, the axon that takes it to the terminal. Okay. And then there's this gap between the terminal and then the dendrite, the next neuron. This gap is called the synaptic gap. Okay. And this is what it looks like. So there's a transmission of an impulse across from one neuron to the next, across the synaptic gap. Okay. And here's the synaptic gap, empty space, terminal right over here, dendrite here, and then there's all these little green things, and they're neurotransmitters. You probably heard of a bunch of them. Dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, GABA, norepinephrine, a whole bunch of them. This is how our brain works in terms of talking. There's different cells talking to themselves and passing on information. A lot of these signals, they travel, what would be equivalent to a couple of 100 miles an hour. It seems like a lot, pretty fast, but it's pretty slow actually. So our brain actually works fairly slowly. Now, neurotransmitters are, by the way, held in these vesicles. And then, as they're released across, they are then taken up by these receptors on the other side. Actually, let's take a look. All along here. Now, there's also enzymes that break these down so they don't stay in the synapse too long. And then some are actually taken back up, reuptake, and then back into the terminal to be used later. Okay. Here's some different neurotransmitters. Most mental illness are usually linked to problems with neurotransmitters. These can often be treated with drugs that affect neurotransmitters and how they're released and how they're taken up. So, depression. Part of it's genetic. Part of it's can be triggered by environmental things. People who have depression usually end up with low serotonin levels, one of the major neurotransmitters. And then what it does is there's drugs now that you've probably heard about that help increase serotonin levels in the synapses. Okay. One of these is called SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it means that instead of these serotonin neurotransmitters staying in the synapse or being retaken up back into the terminal, they stay in the synapse longer. So let's take a look at this. So this is the drug. This is the neurotransmitter. And so these neurotransmitters stay in the synapse longer and eventually dock with the receptors in the dendrites. The earliest SSRIs were Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, things like that. There's a whole bunch of other ones. They're much better than what was around before. The trouble is, depression is a disease of certain regions of the brain and not the whole brain. So when you increase serotonin, you're bathing the whole brain in extra serotonin. and not just the area that actually needs it. And in fact, that's why a lot of these drugs have side effects that aren't pleasant. And that also, for some patients, work and other patients don't. Oh, there's another thing. You may think, okay, serotonin, that's a neurotransmitter from the brain. Well, it turns out our gut also produces serotonin. Because it turns out that our gut and our brain are closely wired together. Our gut tells us, our brain, what's going on in a lot of cases. Okay? So, just so you understand that. So, most drugs that work on our brain do so because they affect specific neurotransmitters. Some drugs, like SSRIs, affect serotonin. Some drugs cause release of stored neurotransmitters, or they mimic the neurotransmitters themselves, such as LSD and MMDA, which is ecstasy, are very much like dopamine, and they attach to dopamine receptors, which is another major neurotransmitter. Anybody in here take ecstasy before? Oh, come on. Okay, everybody. Good. There you go. There's finally someone who's honest. Did it give you a feeling of well-being? Did it give you a feeling of well-being?
It was, I don't know how to describe it. It was just really awesome.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. They're actually using MMDA or ecstasy now. It's classified as a class 1 drug, so supposedly has no medical use, but they're finding that it does have some medical use after all. Perhaps for cancer patients and things like that. So it's also a drug that you cannot get addicted to, by the way, because it releases serotonin, and after a certain point, there's no more serotonin to release, and so if you take it, let's say, one day, and then the next day, you're going to have much diminishing returns. You're not going to get the same sort of high. You'll have to wait about 3 or 4 days for it to work again. Now, the dopamine system. I'm getting tired, so I'm going to sit down. Okay. The dopamine system affects a lot of different things. ADD, attention deficit disorder. It's usually because of low levels of dopamine. And so oftentimes we have a reuptake blocker, kind of like SSRIs for dopamine instead of for serotonin. And for children, it has the opposite effect. Ritalin does compared to adults. For adults, it's a stimulant. For children, it's a depressive. And so that's why there's a lot of kids who can't sit still. They dose them with Ritalin, and then they learn better. But there's too much use of Ritalin and things like that. Now, in the past, when we were hunter-gatherers, kids weren't sitting in classrooms, right? They just weren't doing that. They were out and about. If some kid was hyperactive, well, he actually might end up being a better hunter because he's always, running around discovering things. And his classroom is outdoors, and so some elder might take him along on a little hike and teach him stuff. And he's bouncing off the walls and all that, but you know, it's not like he has to sit there learning from books. We don't live in that environment anymore, so it seems like we have to dose people with these drugs. But in some cases, they're overused, actually. But in some cases, they really can provide a benefit from kids who just cannot control themselves. Okay. So Ritalin inhibits the reuptake of dopamine, much like SSRIs do with serotonin. Normally, it reuptake of dopamine limits signaling. Ritalin inhibits, so there's more in the synapse. Dopamine in the receptor, it stimulates neurons to regulate attentiveness. Okay. Now, a lot of other drugs affect the dopamine system, and one of those is cocaine. So Ritalin has very similar structure to cocaine. With Ritalin, they give you a low dose, and they put buffers in it so it releases slowly. Cocaine, obviously, you want a high dose. So you can either snort it or you can inject it for a really quick dose. It usually doesn't last very long, by the way. That's why cokeheads are always snorting coke over and over and over again. Can't get enough. Kind of like Donald Trump. Addiction. Okay. Drugs are more likely to be addictive if its effects are immediate, euphoric, of short duration. Well, LSD is kind of like that, but it's not addictive at all. It's much like ecstasy. You deplete dopamine and then it doesn't work anymore. Plus, a drug actually has to be capable of inducing what's called withdrawal or tolerance. In other words, needing more, bigger and bigger dose to get the same effect. Opioids are a great example, cocaine. Opioid receptors, there's lots of them in our brain. If someone took, let's say, an opioid at the same dose that, let's say, an addict did, it would probably kill them outright. It'd be too much. So your body habituates to opioids over time. And in fact, that's why opioids are so dangerous, because there's a certain level where they're just going to be toxic. And so addicts are right at that level where they have to stay just below the level where they're going to depress their breathing and their heartbeat, and they die from an overdose. Methamphetamine. It also has tolerance and withdrawal effects, plus it makes your face melt. Had anybody ever seen what a methamphetamine addict looks like? Oh, it's pretty. Okay, drugs alter brain behavior, or behavior usually have to do with neurotransmitters, including drugs that supposedly help for schizophrenia, ADHD, depression, all that kind of stuff. So these are some of the different drugs that affect certain neurotransmitters. Okay. Okay. Let's get back to it. there are a lot of diseases, parasitic and otherwise, that affect the nervous system. Okay, you guys, listen up. This is important. There are lots of diseases that turn people into zombies. We're going to talk about a few of them. You may think, well, that's crazy. Yeah, but it's true. Now, I don't mean the kind of zombies where you come back from the dead, but I mean the kind of zombies where something takes over your mind and makes you do things that you might not want or even realize you're doing. A lot of pathogens and parasites actually do this. They target an animal's nervous system so they can control that individual in terms of transmitting themselves to the next host. If you think about rabies, rabies is a nervous system pathogen. It's a virus. It actually makes animals who get infected with it, it makes them very aggressive and want to bite other animals. And that transmits the disease. There are things that we'll look at in later, like a fungus that actually takes over the minds of insects. And that makes those insects crawl to the highest place where they stay, and then a fungus sprouts out of their head and drops spores all over the place. Okay? So, there is a parasite that it was thought that humans didn't really suffer from. We'd get infected with it, but it wouldn't cause any symptoms. But people are starting to wonder, perhaps not so much. It's called Toxoplasmosis gondii. Patients who get AIDS, they often die from an opportunistic infection. Well, that's just one of those that springs to life in a person's brain. Okay. It's a single-celled eukaryotic parasite. It alternates between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction only happens in cats or felines. Now, the definitive host is a cat because it can reproduce only sexually in a cat's intestine. Okay? Now, toxoplasmosis, cats poop all over the place. They bury their poop, but rats are known and mice are known for getting into the feces of other animals. And so they tend to pick this up. And usually humans get infected because we have cats that we change the litter box. Okay. Now, in most other warm-blooded mammals who are susceptible to this, it doesn't seem like it really causes very much in the terms of disease. But that's starting to change. So first, let's take a look at what it does to mice. It targets the behavior of mice, in other words, their brains, so that mice find cats to be sexually attractive. In other words, mice and rats want to have sex with a cat. Of course, the cat's happy to oblige, in a certain sense, by eating the mouse. So they become one with each other. And then the cycle is, so the mouse has the disease, the mouse goes into a cat, the cat gets infected, more Gondii is produced, they poop it out, and then the cycle continues. But other things can get infected with T. gondii too, including humans. Now, what it does with mice, it actually targets the dopamine system, like we were just talking about. So they're attracted to cat odors sexually, and their reaction times tend to slow down. In other words, once they hang out with a cat, they think, this sounds good. This is cool. Wild sex, right? Okay. And that's the only time kind to have, actually, I want to tell you. Wild sex is good. Okay. Now, it turns out that, like I said, toxo targets the dopamine system. And dopamine is one of those systems that you can target so that it makes individuals feel really good. So, and it does this because this disease, this organism, carries the genes to synthesize dopamine. So it synthesizes extra dopamine. It usually ends up in an animal's brain, and then this extra dopamine affects how the animal reacts to things around it. And so it increases dopamine levels and a feeling of well-being, kind of like ecstasy. Just think of yourself being on ecstasy and you want to have sex with Godzilla. Okay, it's about the same sort of thing. Okay. It turns out Gondii can travel through the blood-brain barrier, so it's able to get into the brain pretty easily. Now, it can easily infect people who are immunocompromised. It also, if, let's say, a woman is pregnant, it can infect her fetus. So if she's changing the litter box, it's a good way to get infected. And in terms of the fetus, it's oftentimes fatal. So it's a very, very bad disease for fetuses. But, and we can get toxo from eating infected animals. Now, let's go on. So, there's this, physician and physiologist from the Czech Republic. And he had cats, and he felt like he was doing things that he shouldn't be doing, and he didn't know why. And he started reading about this disease, and he thought, well, it affects a lot of mammals. Perhaps it's actually affecting the behavior of mammals, including humans. And he started investigating this as a source. And most of this is correlative. But it turns out that subjects in 9/11 studies, they showed that they were both affected, women and men were affected differently. Men were more likely to disregard the rules and be more expeditious, suspicious, jealous, and dogmatic. Well, I mean, that's pretty much all men are like that, aren't they? Okay. Now, by contrast, personality of infected women showed higher warmth, higher superego, suggesting that they were more warm-hearted, outgoing, conscientious, persistent, and moralistic. And, in fact, also more likely to take risks, too, women, in terms of sex. So it might make more women susceptible to sleeping around. And we all know that women shouldn't do that. Okay, now, but it also showed that, like, men are more likely to get into traffic accidents than men who weren't infected with the disease because of road rage, things like that. And there's a few other things. So anyway, it looks like toxo is perhaps who in here has cats? Okay, you guys are in bad shape. No. But perhaps Gondo actually affects human behavior. So if you're a guy and you fly off the handle and you have cats easily, then, maybe there's actually no cure for it anyway, so don't even worry about it. Okay, but these kinds of things do. These are correlations, right? So how would you actually test this in terms of an experiment? Anybody? Yeah.
I have a certain group of men who have to do the same tasks, some that have cats, and some that don't, and see how the results are different.
Sure. Or you could actually just infect people with toxo, and then
Isn't human experiments not allowed anymore?
that's so screwed up, don't you think? Obviously, I have toxo, so I don't care. Yeah, no, in the best of all possible worlds, we take humans, we infect some, not others, and then start poking them and seeing if we could get a reaction out of them. I don't know. But that'd be the best way to do it, actually, is control versus, but we can't do that. So we're stuck with other animals, experimenting on other animals, or correlative, basically correlative studies that really don't control the variables. Okay? So that'd be the best way, though. Oh, that's another great thing about Gondo. If you can show that you're infected with Gondo, perhaps you can use it in court to use as a defense for killing someone. So, like, I wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump is infected with toxo. Oh, also he uses a lot of cocaine too, but never mind. It's also toxo is also associated with an increased risk of schizophrenia in humans as well. So just so you know. Now, go on. So there's a correlation between that and schizophrenia. It's not really obviously proven. It's correlation. Oh, I want to do good.